sure why I didn't put that up. So they rise from 35 to 49%, and vice versa, imports from the empire rise from 32 to 40%. Indeed, there's a conscious effort to try and promote imperial trade. It's in the 1930s, in the 1926 rather, that you get the creation of the Empire Marketing Board to try and market imperial goods in Britain and British goods to the empire. You'll see some examples of films made by the Empire Marketing Board next week. They begin to launch Buy British campaigns, marketing campaigns, for the first time in the 1930s. Indeed, the Empire Marketing Board produces something like 100 films over a space of 10 years. I should add here that the sterling area isn't just, countries that belong to the sterling area aren't just those that were part of the formal British Empire. You also have parts of the informal British Empire continuing to participate in the sterling area. Argentina is a good example of that. Argentina is part of the sterling area down until the Second World War, and so are many Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, Norway, notably. Okay, let me finish up this section by talking about unemployment. You'll remember last week I was talking about the political crisis generated by demobilization. It was not an accident that 1919 was the year of massive unrest and revolts across the empire. Now, one of the other reasons why demobilization was difficult in Britain was that it coincided with, or rather, it helped generate the experience of unemployment. Many of the women who had been working in the munitions industries and for the in government-controlled factories during the First World War were, of course, also demobilized, so that the returning men could return to their jobs. However, there weren't enough jobs to go round. Okay? So even by 1921, even before the cuts in public expenditure that begin in earnest with the Geddes Acts in 1922, you've reached 2 million unemployed people. Now that arguably could have been okay. It could have just been, you know, a regular part of the trade cycle that we've seen throughout the second half of the 19th century. The problem was in the 20s and 30s, unemployment becomes structural. It doesn't go away. Okay? And so you see this nicely mapped on this graph, which begins in 1922, and this is 1939. Okay? So you see that basically 1922, you're up to 1.5 million on this graph. The reason why I'm giving you 2 million is because these are unemployment figures, as all unemployment figures were at this moment, were for insured workers only. Only workers who were part of the social security system that had been introduced in 1911 and extended in 1919. So you have to add on at least 20 to 25% to get the real level of unemployment. So throughout the 1920s and 1930s, basically unemployment hovers consistently between 10 and 25% of the population, and by 1932 has reached 3 million, a historical high not matched until the early 1980s. Now, one of the things that we'll see next week is very important, is that the government tries to portray unemployment not as structural, okay, but as regional. That is to say, they try and say, well, look, there are just these very specific areas where there are high levels of unemployment. But actually, you know, it's not endemic to the country as a whole. And so in 1934, they create this category of the distressed area, which becomes somewhere where government investment is prioritized. But I'll have more to say about that next week. On Thursday. Finally, we should turn to the condition of the people in work. Okay? So here you have the figures basically for average wages and the index for wages and of the cost of living. These are clearly aggregate figures. So you can see that basically it looks like things are getting better off. That gradually people are getting paid better in the 20s. There's a bit of a dip after 1929 through to the early 30s, but then by the end of the 38, you know, it sort of returned to a state of normalcy. And importantly, that inflation is brought right down. Okay, so your money is going further. But I need to emphasize these are aggregate national figures. Okay, and so they're pretty meaningless in terms of talking about individual or sectoral or regional or local experiences. So to give you an example, the wages of coal miners between 1924 and 1935 actually fall from £180 a year to £149 a year. And as we'll see next week, 30% of the population were living on wages of under £3 a week during the late 20s and the 1930s. The consequence of this return of systemic unemployment and poverty was the extension of the forms of welfare that had been created by the new Liberal government before the First World War. Okay? And critically, it was the introduction of national insurance, which, as I said, was extended in 1921 to cover 11 million workers. That meant that these workers, many of the people that were unemployed, by no means all, but many of the people unemployed were receiving types of benefits from the state, and therefore the cost of government borrowing to cover the cost of unemployment was rising considerably. So you see the overall cost of social services, and that's not just unemployment, but it's housing as well, rose almost sixfold between 1914 and 1938. Okay? So overall, the picture that you have is an economy in really dire straits. Okay? Its exports, it's in huge levels of national debt. Its export markets, its traditional strength, have collapsed. The central principles of economic management no longer hold, and you're now experimenting with protection and a new type of currency management through the sterling area. And you have systemic structural unemployment. Okay? It's not a pretty picture. Any questions about that? Yeah. Right. So the question is how much does the military budget contribute to the scale of government borrowing? And the answer is actually remarkably little, because as you remember that the system of imperial policing set up in the 19th century had been very much orientated around the Indian Army. Okay? And the Indian Army was conveniently paid for by India, by the government of India. Okay, so I think that certainly you could talk about the growing cost of the military in Ireland up until the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But really, apart from that, there's very little growing military expenditure. And in fact, what you mainly have in the 20s is a scaling back of the military machine that had been built in the First World War. So much so that by the time you get to the mid-1930s and people are beginning to get worried about Hitler and Germany's, ambitions, and many people are arguing that, the military is in no fit state to fight. Any other questions? No? Okay, so let's turn to the real fun of the responses to this type of economic crisis. And I'm going to suggest to you that the real change here was an embrace of a new belief in planning as a way of getting out of this economic chaos. And this represents a real change of gear between the 19th century liberal laissez-faire idea to a 20th century more socially democratic vision of the state actively planning and intervening in the management of economic and social life. But the story of scientific management, which is arguably where this begins, or at least where a strand of this begins, is an American story. It's F.W. Taylor's The Principles of Scientific Management. Now, in that little extract that you had to read, what is it that Taylor is promising that this new approach of scientific management is going to be able to bring? What is it that he hopes for? Yeah. Right. So it's almost a utopian dream that everyone will benefit, workers and employers alike, just by the more efficient use of resources and of time. Anything else? Anything else struck you in reading Taylor? What's the politics, do you think, in Taylor? Where do you think? Do you think that he thinks of scientific management as a political project, or as something quite different, as just a form of management? No? The really important element here is that Taylor puts faith in the system of management. It's the system, not men, okay, not people, that he thinks will be able to solve the ills of capitalism. Not that he thinks of capitalism as ill, but will make spread wealth and create wealth more. Now, importantly, what scientific management does is make, this is going to sound very, very